Employers find that women can do many jobs as well as men. Some jobs better.
I said, Stephen, I make lists all the time. And he said, that's exactly what I'm looking for. What's funny?
You can't explain a joke because that ruins it. It's straightforward, but it's also something that's pretty powerful and has far-reaching implications, especially in regards to how comedy ages. Even if I don't agree with it, I understand the temptation to think we're not moving in a direction as a society. Things are lost, but there could be ways to hold on to what the outdated parts of ourselves appreciate. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend was the show I've been waiting for now for a long time. It answers a startling number of conceptual problems I've had with society and progress, gaps in how things will click together in the near future. And one such problem I'd like to talk about here is at the heart of the show, and hopefully, in all of our hearts, comedy. Now, comedy was never supposed to be a problem, but something happened in the mid to late 2000s. Something changed. Comedy, and let's say, diverse sensibilities, converged on a battlefield, and this bloody conflagration saw the deaths of careers, second looks at old definitions, it affected the ways of business, and it even raised questions about freedom of speech. And so let's return to that time, to the age of South Park and Family Guy, and stand-up comedians who are banned from or stopped performing at college campuses. I know that's not so long ago, and in fact all those three things are still going on, but Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is still very new, and so its impact is only beginning to be felt. In that time, the idea of taking offense to jokes was starting to become too hot to ignore, and in response I remember the line, "We're not offending anyone in particular, we're offending everyone." What might have been a marketing platitude in a bygone time was now a defense. No displeased that Family Guy pokes fun at Christians and atheists, gay people and straight people, black people and white people. You and me. While that may beg the question, why not just offend nobody, offensive comedy is a reasonable shorthand for freedom of speech because it's testing its integrity, pushing the envelope. However, I believe this is flawed logic, and it comes from an invisible evil many of us have to face at some point within our lifetimes, that our offhand definition of society, our evaluation of who counts, is limited. We're offending everyone ignores at least two things: implicit bias and the uniformity of minds doing the offending, people who might have a different definition than the offended party. Not all jokes are equal. That would defeat comedy. And with Family Guy in particular, yeah, they poke fun at everybody, but the show does have this disproportionate streak of sexism running throughout. It's true that women work on the show and write those jokes, but those images and ideas are brought into being, and that's not nothing. The question of who put the piss in a swimming pool doesn't alter the fact it's there. And what's more, all the writers exist in a cultural context where such things are acceptable and laudable. This was a time when we discovered that the world of comedy, like so many spaces, was exclusive, and we could invent all manner of reason to keep it that way, because status quo was the easy one to back. I mean, just open up Twitter right now and see the process in real time for whatever's in need of change. In 2011, people flipped out over the movie Bridesmaids, because the prevailing wisdom, surviving even to the day, is that women are not funny. Women comedians face an uphill battle, and the resultant singular nature of comedy we received went on to affirm that this is the only kind of comedy that works. The success of gross-out cartoons and Daniel Tosh came with the absence of anything truly different, family-friendly comics and ventriloquists notwithstanding. A comic or a sitcom writer will make observations about the world, and it's not a long walk till those observations are founded on othering, pointing out differences, playing into stereotypes, and sharing in an audience of like-minded people, furthering the boys' club. We didn't think there could be people not in on the joke because we didn't think there could be certain types of people. Now, it is impossible to imagine an Asian American person before you hear about one, but once you do, holding to the original absence of imagination turns not knowing something into willful ignorance. When you fight for freedom of speech, you're fighting for everyone, because everyone deserves the freedom of speech. But when you're writing and performing jokes, there isn't that simplicity or reduction of audience. A joke where the punchline is that the comedian is ignorant about trans issues could be well received by most people in the audience, while at the same time making a trans person watching feel fundamentally other. That those two things, the American people and your audience, got confused, it revealed an unsettling scope of ignorance, but one we should look at as guidance, more so than shameful. It was simpler when it was that boys' club, for sure, and so when different kinds of people arrived, there was friction. Such a natural occurrence, it almost feels blameless, but there are people who just refuse to be cool. Because what it comes down to is we may not know how to talk to everyone in that audience. And even that quandary comes from introspection, asking questions like, what if we're not prepared to joke about everything? Emotionally, intellectually? Would you make that joke or repeat that idea if you cared about the person on the receiving end? And that's the problem with freedom of speech. We see the word freedom and free our minds of accountability. But more relevant here, self-awareness. In our lives, we check our speech constantly, moving between spaces where the culture shifts slightly. We don't curse around our parents, we don't talk about politics at Thanksgiving, we don't call our boss bro or sup girl, we don't make one of our friends feel bad for the enjoyment of our other friends. And we think about those decisions we make as our call. I get that it's hard to imagine abstract strangers in the audience as friends. We're not trained to think that way. So that's where a show like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend comes in, and why it's exciting by itself, but also as part of an evolution on TV. If exclusionary humor was the defining trait of a prior era, then inclusion is a theme being pursued by a next stage. Shows like Jane the Virgin, Steven Universe, Insecure, which are at once dispatches from individual pockets of the world we never paid attention to, but also seem to explore diversity in culture as a matter of course. It's like you didn't even have to do that, but they just do. Now this is interesting because isn't this PC culture the antithesis of humor? I mean, if it was the thing keeping the prior era of comedy in check, then that's the natural conclusion to draw. So then how do these shows, and Crazy Ex-Girlfriend in particular, do the impossible? How do they make inclusive comedy work? Well, I guess it's time to proverbially and literally explain the joke. When we think about like video rental genres on the shelves, action drama, comedy horror, foreign, because that makes sense, there might be a reason why action and horror movies, those two are kind of singled out, why they're sometimes underappreciated. Generally speaking, the elements of action and horror exist for themselves. The big shoot-'em-up scene, the jump scare, that's what people came to see. But the action and horror movies that quote-unquote transcend their genres, they approach those elements as storytelling tools. And that's what Crazy Ex-Girlfriend does, but as a comedy. Its humor is often facility and expression. It exists for a purpose beyond simply making you laugh. And making you laugh is a hell of a thing. It's very powerful. And so that power can be tapped into. This is a story about inclusion, and the humor comes organically from the storytelling. The two are inextricable. So for example, humanization can come through pratfalls. Rebecca's brand of crazy is as absurd as it is relatable. She tries really hard to accomplish everything, and she has to keep this double identity. She's always rushing around. And I think there's also some playing into what's kind of taboo in culture for just us individually, personally, which is to say the things that make Rebecca look dorky or strange.
I ate an old French fry off the floor of my car.
3.1415926.
We're eating a mac and cheese sandwich.
I really think it could be the new John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt.
In a platonic way.
What this does is normalize rather than exoticize this strangeness, because Rebecca continues to not only be a functional adult, in that, these things aren't what causes her dysfunction, but also completely acceptable in, let's say, more traditional ways, as an always viable romantic lead, for example, no matter the old-timey voice.
And right now, I am outraged.
Because she works out, in whatever regard this is, she takes all of her weirdness over that normalization threshold, if we want to call it that. And this normalization is so crucial because, in large part, the show is about mental illness. I mean, we were all worried going in that a show called Crazy Ex-Girlfriend wouldn't be real about it, that it would encourage us to laugh at someone with mental illness, but it instead encourages us to partake in a criticism of shared behaviors. This comes from the design of the experience, which is at once high-level storytelling and unmistakably humanitarian. Just as a side note though, since this comes up all the time, I really do like the title of the show. I mean, I personally just can't 100% pronounce it. I always get caught up in I think it's like the transition from E to X or something. But just, to set the record straight, because it gets a lot of flack, understandably so, but ultimately, it's not even that there's just nothing else you'd call it. It's a good title. So in this case, sometimes it's a matter of characterization, that Greg breaks into this really, self-aggrandizing song that's funny because self-centeredness is funny, but this song is really about insecurity. Hooking into psychological reality and trauma, depression, and Jewish heritage to find humor that isn't offensive is Herculean. And so there's also that matter of tone, and Crazy Ex-Girlfriend can be an emotional bruiser, but is never deliberately mean-spirited. I have seen Rachel Bloom take some heat on Twitter, literally just one Twitter tweet, about something in the math of love triangles. I would guess the line about her learning disability. But all a creator like Rachel Bloom would have to do in response is learn from that new perspective, which isn't disqualified simply for being individual. At the very least, it's entered into a conversation, and maybe it's disqualified after a discussion, but honestly, it doesn't take much to consider it. So other than that, when characters look bad, they're usually on their way to recovery or redemption, When we laugh at an overly excited Rebecca or a Steven, maybe it's because they're being so adorably nerdy.
Blink if this means you love me. He loves me!
That's so different. It makes me want there to be this greater movement toward sensitivity, even if it's just my imagination, because we don't have to laugh at people for being different or for hurting themselves. You know, other things can be funny too. Again though, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is very much a story about inclusion, so what about for the rest of comedy, or for a story that isn't necessarily, or rather outwardly, political? Because as always, everything is political, even the network sitcoms that are not designed to be consumed but merely to exist. What about for those things? And what about for all of us? Well, comedy as storytelling is one thing, and another thing is something I hold near and dear, and it's something called political correctness. That was not a throwaway note earlier. To me, the push against the concept of political correctness is mounted on the grounds that we share in the best possible culture at this moment in time, forgetting even that we also thought that 100 years ago, and 50 years ago, and 7 years ago, when I used to say things like, what are you, retarded? This video game is gay. And now I don't say those things anymore. That process of reducing my vocabulary wasn't effortless, but for whatever cost it incurred, it was greatly outweighed by the value, because it's a value decided by other people, by people whose pain I will never fully know. Okay, but at that point we think, when does it stop? Where do I draw the line? Well, I don't. They do. But that still doesn't answer the question, I suppose. Surely anyone can enter a word into this consideration and say, oh, this affects me, I don't want this anymore. I do want to say that the English language is vast and infinite, there's always another word, but then this isn't really about just words, right? It's about ideas. Put another way, randos entering words for deletion could only come from a wider diversity of voices being heard and listened to and hashed out. That's the evolution of culture, shaped in agreement, or forged in fire, depending on how you look at it. We're gaining and losing these words and ideas all the time. When we reach that point in ourselves where people's feelings are more important than certain privileges we've had since birth and never thought about, it's a kind of liberation. And I think it's an intellectual exercise reflecting on the whole of your engagement with the world through speech. When you think about how your words affect people, when you work backwards from that point, you speak with precision. And that goes beyond just the idea of like taking offense and opens up into persuading, sympathizing, educating, entertaining, impressing, manipulating, anything you need. It takes a lot to think that a conversation isn't over just because I've stopped talking. That is literally the epic journey of men across the globe. Listening is essential. And don't take it from me, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is all of this in action. And it's a huge part of where my fandom comes from. Is it an entertaining show? Yes. Is it great to be represented as an Asian American man? Yeah, well, that guy's not 120 pounds with glasses, but yes. But Crazy Ex-Girlfriend really feels like an ambassador from the future, as well as a hand and extension. This whole thing, it's trial and error. I may be so egotistical to publish this manifesto in a video, but by no means am I close to the end of a journey. It's possible this journey never ends, so long as society continues to evolve. You know what, it wasn't until a few weeks ago that I learned it's more accurate to say a transgender woman is assigned male at birth, rather than saying she's born male. That was embarrassing. But even that specifically comes from peeling back something I'd learned earlier and replacing it with an update. The mistake we might be making here is thinking that language and values are fused to our identities. Again, thinking we're the best possible, making improvement a sign of weakness. And people who come at you with that stuff, people who lament PC culture and the softening of America, would be thought of as millennials by their own forebears. I mean, a house with heat, houses shouldn't coddle you, how are you going to be prepared for the world? It's just a matter of keeping things in perspective. And that's not always easy. But trial and error could also be liberating, the ability to fail and learn something new, and become a better person in the eyes of someone else. That's on everyone involved. For one to screw up and learn something, and for the other to forgive. And that asks a lot of the other. That asks for discretion, for sorting motives, and maybe that's not fair. But if you, yourself, have the capacity for that discretion, you might be surprised one day. And there's no better feeling that I had patience long enough to see someone's heart. Because people may lead with their political views, and those may be offensive, but who knows what's behind that posturing? Political correctness is just another facet of furthering conversation between people. That's why I love art. I mean, not like fine art, but like images and ideas exchanged between creator and audience. Before it even takes shape, it's a beautiful thing.
The government's policy is that women should get the same pay that men get for similar work.